Next, let's look briefly at how you organize methods or functions inside a class and how you organize code inside a method. So I said earlier that when you execute something from the command line in Java, it always starts at the method called main. But if you look in the previous section on loops, you'll see that the code was not in the method called main. The code was in methods called list entries, list nums1, list nums2, and list nums3. Well, how did this work? And the answer is that main called those methods. So I put all 4 of the function definitions inside the same class loop test, and then I called them from main. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that I declared these methods as static. We'll explain in the upcoming sections on object-oriented programming what static means and exactly why I did this. For now, just very temporarily, take it on faith that if a class is going to call a method directly from main without making a class first, we don't even know how to make classes yet, if main is going to call another method directly, the method that it calls should also be declared static. All right, the next issue is how to organize code within a method. And the indentation, how you align things, is actually almost as important as how you write the code itself. Because when someone comes along later and maintains your code, they are not going to act as if they're a Java compiler and walk through and find all the curly braces and try to figure out which one is inside. Instead, they're going to just scan your code and look at the indentation. So it's very important that when you open a block, like a block of code inside a loop, that you indent. And you open another block, you should indent again. And so the code on the right here, where I failed to indent, is not just considered poor style. An experienced Java programmer would just consider it wrong. Even though it executes properly and gives the same answer, it's almost impossible to maintain. Because Java programmers who come and maintain your code later do not count the curly braces, they look at your indentation. This is such an important point that some programming languages like Python just omit the curly braces altogether and just use the indentation as decided. Next, many people think that the Python approach is going too far, but nevertheless, the point is that the person who maintains your code is not going to count the curly braces. Instead, they're going to just look at the indentation. So it's critical. It's almost considered required that if you start a block, like a for loop or an if statement, that you indent. So the first rule is, if you start a block, always indent. The second related rule is never change your indentation except when you're changing your nesting level. So it would be considered wrong to have 2 statements that are indented differently when they're not nested differently. That would be considered wrong, and that would be considered wrong. Okay, those are 2 points that all Java programmers agree on. When you start a block, you should indent. You should indent consistently. You should only change your indentation level when you change your nesting level. But what people cannot agree on in Java is exactly how much you should indent and where you should put the curly braces. So if you indent 2 spaces consistently, that's fine. If you indent 4 spaces consistently, that's fine. If you put the curly braces on the same line, or you put the curly braces on the next line, that is mostly considered fine. Some Java programmers have strong opinions about it, and there have been entire family feuds where one clan of the family has refused to talk to each other because of where the other clan puts the curly braces. But let me kind of summarize the argument on each side and then say what my opinion on this is. So the argument in favor of putting the curly braces on the same line as you start the for statement or the if statement or whatever the block is that your code is shorter. It takes fewer lines. It's vertically shorter. And when it's vertically shorter and you look at your code inside of an editor like Eclipse, you can see more context, and so it's easier to understand. That's the argument in favor of putting the curly braces on the same line as the loop or the if statement. The argument in favor of putting the curly brace on the next line is that the open curly brace and the closed curly brace line up underneath each other. Now, the people in the other camp say, well, it doesn't matter if they're underneath each other because no one looks at the curly braces anyway. They just look at the indentation, and the indentation is the same either way. Well, perhaps. But anyway, some Java programmers feel strongly about this, but there's no universal agreement. There's universal agreement that when you start a block, you must indent, and you should never change your indentation except when you change your nesting level. My personal opinion on should the curly braces go on the same line or the next line is it doesn't matter. I really don't think it matters, and I think that if you are a software manager, you don't have to impose coding conventions on your team. It's just not that important. Conversely, if you're on a team and your software manager has imposed coding conventions and says you have to put your curly braces on the same line or on the next line, whichever, and you believe in the other one, don't bother arguing. Save your ammunition for things that really matter and just go along with the flow. It's not that important. So what's important is you indent consistently. What's not important is where you put the curly braces.